King Charles's speech on Canadian sovereignty draws scrutiny from Indigenous leaders amid colonial legacy. And what a crappy article. Well, that's not a crappy article, but it's a crappy title. Because really, all of the articles about the King's visit to Canada centered the King as acting as effectively a buckler and shield for Mark Carney against Donald Trump, because of this whole idea that, Canada's going to become the 51st state. But what that whole exercise helped to erase was the questions of Canada's colonial history. And I made reference to that in 2 Royal Corners ago. I said that the King wasn't reading the room when he went out there and basically reaffirmed Canada's colonial, Britain's relationship with Canada and their sovereignty, because I argued that same point. And now we have an article this week which effectively was saying something very close to the same point that I was making. So in this article, it says Indigenous leaders voice concerns about colonial symbolism, which effectively was what that exercise was for the King. It was colonial symbolism. Many First Nation leaders in Canada stressed the need for actual action, tangible action. The same sort of thing we're talking about when we were talking previously about the Green-Eyed King and his embedded, reporter buddy, Rhiannon Mills. The point is, there's no point in telling us about all these great endeavors. We've been listening to the great endeavors and the great plans that these individuals and this institution is going to do. However, actual, tangible, measurable, evidenced outcomes are very low on the ground. And that's the point that the First Nation leaders are making in relation to the King's visit to Canada, where he murmured something totally inconsequential about land. The government, he says, has acknowledged past harms against Indigenous peoples. However, reconciliation efforts, just as usual, have lost momentum in recent years. How familiar is this story with the proper examination of the institution of the House of Windsor? Wherever you go, you don't actually have that proper examination. You have symbolism, you have gestures, you have all of these grandiose puff experiences that, 5 or 7 months down the road, it's just a list on an itinerary. There's no meaningful outcomes as a consequence of any of these things. Hashtag Kate's early years. What's happened with that? Just another puff exercise in media narrative. The whole visit by the King, Indigenous leaders felt, was a way of harking back to a colonial narrative, which effectively is one of settlement, conquest and destruction at the expense of Indigenous people. Professor David MacDonald, a political scientist from the University of Guelph in Ontario, was speaking from a Treaty 4 lands in Saskatchewan. Standing up to Trump, he said, was overshadowed Indigenous concerns completely, as if we matter just right now. That too is a strategy of settler colonialism. So basically what he said there, but I didn't read it very well, he said that because the whole thing, if you think about the media narrative, it was about, the King is standing up to Trump and, he's supporting Mark Carney. There was no conversation there about the impact of his visit on Indigenous people's claims to their lands, to the settler colonialism, which has impacted the Indigenous people of Canada to this day, where they have poor health outcomes, they have shorter life expectancy, there is significant systemic inequality in their communities, there's lack of proper, water and facilities. None of that was part of the conversation when he was there. No, it was just to put his arm around Mark Carney. And then the Indigenous first leaders have rebuked him for it. So I'm glad they did, basically. Like I said, mans don't know how to read the room, okay? Him and his side salad wife, they got no idea about what they actually look like to other people outside of the echo chamber that they occupy. Most people don't look at you favorably. Trust me, they don't.